You miss 50% or more of your shots because you don't know your camera. Learning techniques doesn't mean just knowing how to set up the correct shutter speed, aperture and ISO. Those are the basics, and that's not enough to be efficient and reactive in the field. Hi everyone, in this video I want to give you my personal guide on how to set up your Fujifilm camera in order to be more confident using it when you are outdoor, working quickly without wasting time staring hours at the camera display, to figure out where the heck a specific function is hidden and to get more successful shots and fun. Now I'm going to go through how I set up my Fujifilm X-T4 photography settings for landscape photography, trying to explain not just the what and how, but why I select a specific function layout in order to be super efficient on mastering the camera. Except for a few differences based on the camera layout, most of my settings are the same for other X-series camera bodies. And because I use my Fuji X-T4 not just for stills but also for video, the buttons and dials are set up in a very personal way. Anyway, keep in mind our goal is to understand the underlying principle that's applicable to whatever camera you have. That being said, what I do may not completely work for you, so take what you really need. Let's dive into the main camera settings. I'm gonna start by going through all the dials and buttons. On the top of the camera, the ISO dial is always switched on C, so I can adjust the sensitivity directly with the front command dial. On the wrench icon on the menu under button dial setting, command dial settings, the default settings are already set correctly. The shutter dial is set to T, so I'm able to change the shutter speed super easily with the rear command dial. To change the aperture, I much prefer to use the aperture ring of the lens. It's very convenient, especially in cold weather when I wear gloves. About the driver dial, I mostly use the three settings, the S setting for single shots, the CL when I need to capture a sequence of shots, for instance to have more options when there are moving elements in the frame like waves, branches moving in the wind, etc. The CH mode is too fast for my needs and I'm very careful about the number of shots I take. I want to spend as little time as I can in Lightroom to make the selection. The exposure compensation dial, if I use the aperture or shutter priority mode, not very often. The shutter button, I just left it at the default settings, so halfway focus locked and pushed all the camera takes the shots. I don't like to decouple the focus and the shutter. Okay, now I'm going to show you how I customized each custom button. You can access the customization in two ways, navigating the main menu, setup, button dial setting, and function setting, and here you have a list of all the buttons customizable. Or a handy shortcut to access the same menu is by holding down the display back button for a couple of seconds. As I said, since I use the X-T4 both for stills and videos, I arrange everything accordingly. The function 1 on the top of the X-T4, I set that to F-Log View Assist, a newly added function that makes shooting F-Log easier. Video is converted equivalent to BT709 for display to make it easier to get the correct exposure in the video recording. The function number 2 drives settings to adjust all the settings when you are in the bracketing mode. It provides easy access to the number of frames I want to capture as well as the step for each exposure. Usually I keep it at 2 stops and a number of frames of 3. For critical dynamic range scenes, I'll bring the settings up to 5 or 7 exposure. Continuous sequence setting, I much prefer to start the sequence saved from the darkest to the brightest exposure. With the standard setting and a larger number of frames than 3, the thumbnail strip in Lightroom tends to be messy. And the number 3 function button, IS mode boost. This one is to activate or deactivate the iOS boost when I'm recording videos. That's designed for handheld shooting without panning or tilting. The function 4, zebra settings, a super useful exposure warning tool that helps to check the overexposed area in the frame, or you can set it to check the skin tones. Function number 5, white balance. Even though I'm used to set that on daylight, with videos I want to have quick access to set a custom white balance with the gray card before I start filming. Function number 6, self-timer of 2 seconds. I used to use the remote shutter release, but it's quite helpful to have the self-timer directly to the D-pad. On the touch screen, I have some swipe function. The function 1, swipe up, is for the face detection, on off for videos and stills for environmental portraits. The function 2, swipe left for electronic level. Function 3, swipe right, AF range limit, which is a wonderful function to limit the range where the camera focuses, improving the focusing speed and reducing dramatically the chances to miss the focus. The function 4, swipe down, IS mode to switch easily between the IS shooting only mode and the IS continuous mode. The AEL button is completely remapped to control the internal external mic level when I record videos. AF on button to select the full HD high-speed recording when I'm in movie mode for slow-mo footage capture. Then the rear dial focus check is tapped for magnification. The magnifier tool helps to check whether or not the current focus is spot on. Simply press the rear command dial, either single point AF or in manual mode, to magnify everything that is covered by the active focus frame. You can change the magnification level by turning the rear command dial. By selecting the AF/MF setting and then focus check and selecting on, the magnifier tool is automatically activated when you turn the manual focus ring of the lens in manual focus mode. The Q buttons, I just keep it as Q menu by default. Just by remapping your camera buttons and dials, your speed will dramatically increase. Each gesture has to be consistent and repeatable. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to improve and practice the muscle memory of your hands to speed up the capture process and get more successful shots. You need to hone your mechanical memory. So that's it for the buttons and dial. Let's move on to the menu. I go through the main Fuji X-T4 settings, which I consider to be essential. So let's go ahead with the image quality. I always use RAW format, RAW recording lossless, which means compressed file. There is no substantial difference in image quality compared with the uncompressed version, and you can save a lot of your hard drive memory space. Film simulation, it doesn't affect RAW photos, and I use the ProNeg standard film simulation with customized settings to get a flatter image representation on display. So let me know in the comments below which film simulation you use. I'm very curious. Then white balance, I always use daylight as a white balance setting because I always shoot in RAW format, so I can adjust the temperature whenever I want. However, I like to have a coherent color sequence throughout the entire shooting, especially during the sunrise and sunset session. Using the auto white balance sometimes it's quite tricky to have a good representation of the gradual changes, the gradual variation in terms of global colors. Dynamic range, default setting is just for JPEG photographers. The dynamic range function is a genuine plus. The camera manages the dynamic compression and the compression of the data acquired by itself. For RAW shooters, don't mind, leave it at the default settings at 100, so without any alteration of JPEG preview on the display. You have the opportunity to tackle the task yourself and manage the editing based on your specific preferences. Long exposure noise reduction, I usually keep it turned off. For long exposures, the camera will take 2 photos, one of the actual scene, another with the shadow current closed, that is simply a dark frame. Bear in mind that if you expose the shot, let's say for 3 minutes, you will have to wait double the time, which means 6 minutes total before you can review the image and start to use your camera again for the next shot. In terms of color space, Adobe RGB doesn't affect RAW photos, but it's a bit more accurate for histogram than sRGB. Mount adapter settings, 24mm or 35 or 50. I don't use this function for many landscape photography, but for travel or portraits, I do love to use vintage lenses that need a specific converter to be used with the Fuji cameras. AF mode, I like to always use the single point mode since it gives me the finest control for focusing in most cases. Number of focus points, 425, since it gives me the most control. The pre-AF off, with the pre-AF set to on, the camera will always focus on whatever is covered by the active AF frame, even when the shutter button is not half depressed. Pre-AF burns plenty of power because the autofocus in the lens is always working. On the other hand, using it can potentially result in a quicker AF response. If you shoot a lot of action, the pre-AF may be helpful, but don't forget to pack a few extra batteries. Normally, I set this option to off. The manual focus assistant on peak, red high, active when you are in manual focus. The focus peak highlight emphasizes the edges of objects when they are in focus. This is a very helpful function to be very precise in focusing. Depth of field scale on pixel, we should have a longer conversation about that. For the moment, what we are interested in is to set it on pixel basis, which helps you to assess the depth of field for pictures that will be viewed at a high resolution on computers or other electronic displays. Touchscreen mode off. I don't like to use the touchscreen in field except for the basic gestures I discussed before. Interval time shooting for taking time lapses. It lets you select the interval between shots and the total number of photos. Photometry multi, which is the default metering mode, matrix metering or evaluative metering. It takes a series of readings in zones that cover the entire frame and then calculates the overall average exposure value. This is my favorite exposure metering mode. IS mode in shooting setting. IS mode, you can choose between two basic iOS modes. iOS mode 1 continuous is the default setting. It's always stabilizing the image even when you are just looking through the viewfinder before you press the shutter button. The iOS mode 2, shooting only engages when you fully depress the shutter button to take an image. I prefer to use the iOS in mode 2, shooting only. Mode 1 is useful at very slow shutter speeds and when you are using very long focal length because the camera will always stabilize the live view image, making it easier to compose and focus a shot. Make sure to turn off the iOS when you are working from a sturdy tripod or with shutter speeds that are slower than a second. You should also switch it off for panning shots. My menu settings, I like to create a custom menu where I can find some other handy functions. You can add, you can rank and remove items. I've got some custom menu shortcuts like the intervalometer, drive setting, AF mode, the preview exposure white balance, which is a function that needs to be deactivated when you use off-camera flashes in low light conditions or studio, and then the mount adapter settings for manual focus lenses. Sound setup, I adjusted volume levels of all my bips for the autofocus, the self-timer, the operating volume, shutter sound, playback volume, and so on. In terms of screen setup, the EVF brightness, I put it at 3. I prefer to have a fixed luminosity level for the EVF. The LCD brightness +2, so a fixed value to avoid any fluctuation that I would have with the auto setting, which works in tandem with the ambient light intensity. Image display off, that chooses how long images are displayed after shooting, and I keep it off. Framing guidelines, HD. I prefer to use the HD frame option rather than the regular thirds. And I think this is good to visualize how much I will lose by cropping my image to 16:9. It's super helpful and super handy for time lapses and of course to shoot videos. Auto rotate PB off, choose on to automatically rotate tall pictures during playback. Focus scale unit meters, choose the units used for the focus distance indicator. Dual display settings, choose the content of the two windows in the dual display. I have to press display back button multiple times to go to the specific live view. The right small window shows the entire frame, while the left large window shows a close-up of the focus area. It works only in manual focus mode. In terms of display custom settings, here you can select the elements you want to be displayed on the EVF and LCD, like the electronic level, the histogram, highlight alerts, and many others. Here you can see how my display looks in terms of display settings. Moving forward with the power management, auto power off in 5 minutes, performance normal, EVF, boost settings, FPS, default settings. Regards to the save data settings, frame number continuous, save original images is on off. Choosing on, you can save and process copies of pictures taken using the red eye removal. I don't use it. Edit file name to stop your custom file naming, card slot setting, sequential, backup or raw JPEG. I use the backup setting. It's very convenient to have an additional backup of the shots. Then select folder. You can create and select different folders where to save your capture. Copyright info, where to put your info. And the last one, connection settings. I don't use the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi connection since the app I think is not reliable at all. Once you have your camera settings customized to your liking, try to memorize them, simulating the actual use in order to create that sort of mechanical memory. Repeat the same gestures, the same patterns for a certain amount of time since they stick in your mind and become natural and instinctive. Think like a musician. Practice and rehearsal for musicians helps to build confidence and develop a strong relationship with their instruments. Practicing is not the actual performance, so practice again, and repeat till you feel confident. Only then you'll be ready for the stage. I hope you got some value from the video. If you have any questions, drop me a comment down below. Give the video a thumbs up if you found it useful, and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao!